In the collective memory of our species, there exists a curious blind spot. We can tell you the name of the architect who stacked stone upon stone to build a pyramid, or the general who marched legions across a frozen river. We venerate the hands that held the brush of the Sistine Chapel and the minds that calculated the orbit of the planets. But ask yourself this: who fed them? Not as a vague concept of society, but actually, who bent their spine into the shape of a question mark over the wet soil? Who rose before the sun, not to conquer the world, but to coax a single grain of wheat from the resistant earth? We have a strange habit of viewing the past through a pane of glass. We admire the spectacle of civilization, the temples, the towers, the tilled fields, while the sweat that greased the gears of that machine remains invisible, wiped clean from the record. Yet, if you look closely enough at the first laws ever written, the first ledgers ever kept, and the first fences ever built, a distinct and unsettling pattern emerges. There is a quiet, administrative horror that stretches back to the very dawn of settlement. It is the story of how a person becomes inventory. It is the history of treating peasants like livestock, and it begins not with a violent act of conquest, but with a seed and a list. To find the first evidence of this strange transformation, we must travel back further than kings and castles, further than iron swords or bronze plows. We go to the Fertile Crescent, roughly 9,000 years ago, to a place called Çatalhöyük in what is now Turkey. Here, humanity was just learning the trick of staying in one place. We were fresh off the invention of agriculture, and with that invention came a new, terrifying question: who owns the grain? In a hunter-gatherer band, you own what you can carry, but in a village with mud brick houses and communal ovens, you own what you can defend, and more importantly, what you can count. At Çatalhöyük, we find no grand palaces yet. The houses are packed together like cells in a honeycomb, their entrances on the roof, their interiors dense with the smell of smoke, lentils, and human closeness. And in the most important rooms, the ones where the ancestors are buried beneath the sleeping platforms, we find something more chilling in its simplicity: the bull skulls, or bucrania. They were plastered into the walls, coated with layer after layer of white clay until the horns jutted out like permanent tenants, like the bones of the house itself. The bull was the first creature we stripped of wild agency and turned into a walking, breathing commodity, a measure of wealth that could be bred, corralled, and slaughtered on a schedule. It was the prototype for the relationship of ownership over a living, breathing being whose sole purpose was to serve the nutritional and economic needs of the house. But here is what we often miss about Çatalhöyük. The human dead were treated in a way that prefigured the treatment of the living peasant for millennia to come. The bodies of the deceased were buried under the floor, under the very spot where the family slept, ate, and procreated. They were not removed to a separate realm of the dead. They were integrated into the domestic space, their bones sometimes disinterred, their skulls plastered and painted with red ochre to recreate the face, and then passed around, displayed, or reburied. The dead were a resource of the house, just as the stored grain was a resource. The ancestors were the spiritual fertility that guaranteed the material fertility of the fields. And if the dead could be property, if they could be kept in the floor like a sack of emmer wheat, then the living who worked those fields were only a short conceptual step away from the same status. The house owned the bull skull on the wall. The house owned the skull of the grandfather. And soon, the house would own the labor of the son. This brings us to the threshold of a new world. Çatalhöyük was a village of perhaps 8,000 souls at its peak, enormous for its time, but still a place where everyone likely knew everyone else's face. The true transformation, the moment when the peasant becomes a number, requires something more. It requires the city, and the city requires the scribe. The leap from owning the bull to owning the man who follows the bull was not a long one. It required only the invention of the written word to make it official, and that invention brings us, a few thousand years later, to the floodplains of Mesopotamia, where the clay is thick and the sky is hot. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers are moody, unpredictable gods. One year they flood too little, and the fields crack into fissures deep enough to swallow a child. The next year they flood too much and wash away the irrigation ditches, the mud brick walls, and the careful boundaries between one man's barley and another's. In this precarious world, where survival depended on the collective ability to channel water, the first true states were born, and with the state came the first true bureaucracy. Here, in the world's first cities like Uruk and Ur, we see the human being formally catalogued alongside the oxen. The temple complexes, called in Sumerian, were not merely places of worship. They were the central economic planning agencies of the ancient world. The god owned the land. The god owned the seed. The god owned the irrigation canals. And the god, through his human stewards, the priests and the scribes, owned the labor of the people who worked that land. Let us pause and look at a real document, one of the earliest administrative texts ever discovered. It comes from the city of Uruk, around 3,200 years before the birth of Christ. It is a small clay tablet, no larger than a modern smartphone, covered in the earliest form of writing we call proto-cuneiform. The symbols are not yet sophisticated enough to tell a story or record a poem. They are pictograms and numbers. And what do they record? They record the distribution of grain rations to workers. The tablet lists a pictogram of a human head with a bowl next to it, followed by the symbol for barley and a series of impressed wedges that denote quantity. This is the world's first paycheck, and it is also the world's first chain. The worker receives sustenance not because they are a member of the community, not because they have a right to eat, but because they have performed labor for the temple. Their body is a furnace, and the barley is the fuel. The scribe does not care about the worker's name. The scribe cares that the fuel has been dispensed and that the work has been done. This is the birth of the corvée system. The word corvée comes much later from the Latin corrugata, meaning a contribution, but the concept is as old as Sumer. It is the mandatory, unpaid labor exacted by the state from its subjects. The king or the temple would issue a call, and the men of the villages would be rounded up. They would leave their own meager plots of land, their own families, their own sick goats and hungry children, and they would march to the city. There they would dig canals under the Mesopotamian sun, a sun so fierce it could bake the clay tablets they wrote on into permanent stone. They would haul baskets of earth up the steep sides of the ziggurats, the great artificial mountains that connected heaven and earth. They would build the walls that kept out the enemies, and just as effectively, kept the peasants in. Look at the Code of Ur-Nammu, the oldest surviving law code in the world, etched into clay over 4,000 years ago during the third dynasty of Ur. The king, Ur-Nammu, presents himself as a just ruler, a shepherd of his people. But read the laws closely. It is obsessed with the value of a slave, but the lines are already blurred between the outright slave and the free peasant. The laws set a fine for knocking out the eye of a common man, and a lesser fine for knocking out the bone of a slave. They are not quite the same as an ox, but they are a different species of property entirely. The law reads like a price list for damaged goods. And what of the peasant who cannot pay his debts? The law is silent on mercy. The debt slave, the amas or gami, was a common feature of Sumerian life. A bad harvest, an illness in the family, a loan of silver to buy seed for the next planting, and suddenly the peasant and his entire family belonged to the creditor. They worked the creditor's fields. They ate the creditor's rations. They were, for all practical purposes, livestock with a different name. Then we come to the famous Code of Hammurabi, a towering stele of black diorite standing over 7 feet tall, carved around 1754 BC. The king stands before the sun god Shamash, receiving the rules of order directly from the divine hand. The text is a ledger of flesh. Law 245 reads, "If a man hire an ox and kill it through neglect or blows, he shall restore ox for ox to the owner." Law 246 reads, "If a man hire an ox and break its leg or cut its neck tendon, he shall compensate the owner with ox for ox." And just a few lines away, we read about the penalties for striking a laborer or killing a servant. The juxtaposition is not accidental. It reflects a worldview that saw the laboring body as a unit of economic value, interchangeable and compensable. In the Mesopotamian mind, the laborer, the serf, the peasant, they existed in a category called mushkinum. The exact meaning of this Akkadian word is debated by scholars, but it clearly refers to a class of people who were not chattel slaves exactly, but were subjugated ones. They were tied to the land the way a vine is tied to a stake. They couldn't leave. They couldn't stop working. They had some legal rights. They could own property in some cases. They could testify in court, but they were fundamentally unfree. And the temple scribes, sitting cross-legged in the shade of the ziggurat, their heads shaved and their reed styluses sharp, counted them. They used the very same cuneiform reeds to tally a basket of barley, a head of cattle, and a corvée laborer due for a month of digging irrigation canals. The first bureaucracy was not designed to serve the people. It was designed to manage the crop that was the people. The scribal schools, the aduba or tablet houses, drilled this worldview into their students. Young boys from wealthy families would spend years copying the same lists over and over, lists of trees, lists of stones, lists of gods, lists of professions. And in these lists, the enger, the farmer, appears not as a person, but as a function. He is the one who holds the plow. He is the one who scatters the seed. He is the one who irrigates the field. His identity is his task. The Sumerian literary texts, like the instructions of Shurupak or the farmer's instructions, are full of advice on how to manage workers. Do not abuse a worker, one proverb says, but do not let him be idle. Another, a worker's mouth is a raging storm, fill it with bread and it will be silent. The peasant is a force of nature to be managed, a storm to be calmed, a tool to be maintained. He is not a participant in the conversation of civilization. He is the subject of it. This pattern replicates with mechanical cruelty across the globe wherever the plow cuts the soil. Consider ancient Egypt. We stand in awe of the Great Pyramid of Giza. The narrative has mercifully shifted in recent decades. We now know the builders were not slaves in the Ben-Hur sense, not a vast army of Hebrews groaning under the lash. They were skilled workers who took pride in their craft, who organized themselves into teams with competitive names like the Drunkards of Menkaura, and who were buried with honor near the tombs of their god-kings. Their bones show evidence of excellent medical care, of a diet rich in beef and bread, of a life that, while brutally hard, was valued by the state. But let us look past the stonecutters to the vast, invisible sea of the Delta. Let us look past the elite workmen's village of Deir el-Medina to the millions of Meret, the peasant serfs whose names are lost to the sand. Egypt was, as the Greek historian Herodotus famously observed, the gift of the Nile. The river flooded every year, covering the valley floor in a layer of rich black silt. This was the source of Egypt's fabulous wealth, but it was also the source of its totalitarian control over the peasant body. During the annual inundation, when the black silt water covered the fields and made farming impossible, the state saw not a population resting, but a population idle. And like a farmer with a team of oxen who cannot stand in the barn, the pharaoh's vizier issued the corvée. The word in ancient Egyptian was ket, and it was a tax on the body. It was the forced extraction of muscle power. The peasant was rounded up, counted in a census often depicted with the same herding sticks used for goats, and marched to the quarries or the mud pits to make bricks. The tomb paintings of the Middle and New Kingdoms are a window into this world. We see the sesh, the scribe, sitting cross-legged with his papyrus roll and his palette of red and black ink. Before him stands a line of peasants. Their bodies are depicted with the exaggerated posture of exhaustion, shoulders hunched, bellies protruding from malnutrition, hair unkempt. The scribe holds a stick. A famous tomb painting from the Middle Kingdom, in the tomb of the vizier Rekhmir, shows a foreman with a stick and a man lying on the ground, with the caption, "The stick is in my hand, do not be idle." Another shows a peasant being beaten while the scribe calmly records the punishment. It is the exact posture and language of a goat herd driving a reluctant animal up a rocky hill. The Egyptians were meticulous record keepers. The Palermo stone, one of the oldest historical documents from Egypt, records the reigns of the early pharaohs. And what does it record? The height of the Nile flood, the number of cattle in the royal herds, and the number of captives taken in war. But it also records the census of the gold and the fields, and the census of the people. The people are listed alongside the gold and the fields. They are a resource to be measured. The peasants were fed grain rations. Perjet, the house of eternity, was the granary. The rations were carefully calculated to provide just enough calories to sustain life and labor, but not enough to allow for the accumulation of surplus, not enough to allow for the luxury of leisure, not enough to allow for the dangerous contemplation of a different life. When you read the ancient Egyptian lists of the houses of life, they meticulously document the fodder for the sacred Apis bull. So many bundles of fresh grass, so many measures of fine grain. In a separate ledger, they document the bread and beer for the meret, the peasant serfs. Different columns, same concept, maintenance cost of a productive asset. The Apis bull was a living god, pampered and adorned with jewels. The peasant was a living tool, fed and housed just well enough to keep him from dying. The distance between the two was a matter of theology, not biology. And what happened when the peasant could not meet his quota? The Egyptians had a word for it, bak, meaning work or tax, and if the bak was not delivered, the punishment was swift and brutal. The papyrus Lansing, a school text used to train scribes, contains a vivid description of the misery of the peasant's life. It is written as a warning to a schoolboy who is considering abandoning his studies. I have seen the metalworker at his work, the text reads, his fingers like the claws of a crocodile. He stinks worse than fish eggs. I have seen the peasant in the field. His back is bent forever. When he reaches home in the evening, he is worn out like a piece of old cloth. The tax collector comes. He beats him with a stick. He ties up his wife and children. The peasant flees. He abandons his field. He abandons his home. He is lost. The purpose of this text was to terrify the young scribe into staying in school, into becoming the one who holds the stick rather than the one who feels it. And it worked. For 3,000 years, the Egyptian peasant remained in the field, his back bent, his name unrecorded, his existence a footnote in the glorious story of the pharaohs. Travel east now, to a civilization that emerged independently but developed eerily similar structures of control. Shang Dynasty China, roughly the time of King David in the Levant, around 1600 to 1046 BC. The earliest Chinese script is found on oracle bones, tortoise shells, and ox scapulae, heated until they cracked to divine the future. The king would ask a question: will the harvest be plentiful? Will the Dai spirit approve of the number of Chang captives we sacrifice? Will the king's toothache cease? The diviner would apply a hot bronze poker to the bone, and the resulting cracks would be interpreted as the answer of the ancestors. The Qiang were a neighboring pastoral people. They were not Chinese, they were outsiders, barbarians, and in the divination records they are captured, counted, and then, with terrifying frequency, butchered alongside cattle in ritual offerings. One oracle bone records the sacrifice of 300 Chang captives in a single ceremony. Another records the sacrifice of 9 Chang and 3 cattle. The Chang and the cattle are listed together, their blood offered to the same ancestors, their deaths recorded with the same brush strokes. The Chang were human beings, but they were not Ren, not people, in the sense of belonging to the Shang world. They were Wu, things, or creatures. They were livestock with a different shape. And what of the Shang peasant? The Zhongren, or multitudes? They were not sacrificed in the same numbers as the Chang captives, but their lives were no less controlled. The king's power rested on his ability to command the labor of the Zhongren. They built the great walled cities like Zhengzhou and Anyang. They worked the fields of millet and wheat. They served in the king's armies when the bronze weapons were distributed, and they were described in the oracle bone inscriptions as living, moving terrain. The king would ask, should the king order the multitudes to clear the new field? Should the king order the multitudes to plant the millet? The Zhongren are never the subject of the sentence. They are always the object. They are acted upon. They are a force to be deployed, like the river's floodwater or the oxen's strength. The Chinese language itself encodes this worldview. The word for to herd is mu. The word for to govern or to shepherd the people is also mu. They share the same root and the same written character, a hand holding a stick next to an animal. The ruler was the musho, the herdsman of the people. The people were the min, a word that originally meant the blind ones, or the ones who cannot see. They were docile and fecund, like a healthy flock of sheep. The ruler's duty was not to improve their interior lives, not to educate them or listen to their desires. His duty was to ensure they were fed, watered, and protected from predators so that they could continue to produce the grain, the labor, and the soldiers that sustained the state. A kingdom without peasants was like a pasture without grass. It was a barren wasteland, fit only for wild beasts. This metaphor of the shepherd and the flock is one of the most persistent and insidious in human history. It appears in the earliest texts of Mesopotamia, where the king is called Sipa, shepherd, of the people. It appears in the Egyptian royal titulary, where the pharaoh is the good shepherd who leads his flock to green pastures. It appears in the Hebrew Bible, where God is the shepherd and Israel is his flock. And it appears in the Homeric epics, where the king is Poimen Laon, shepherd of the people. But what does it mean to be a shepherd? A shepherd loves his flock, yes. He protects them from wolves. He leads them to water. He knows each one by name, perhaps. But he also shears them for their wool. He slaughters them for their meat. He decides which ram will breed with which ewe. He owns them. They have no will of their own, or if they do, it is a will that must be suppressed for their own good. The shepherd is benevolent, but his benevolence is the benevolence of the owner toward his property. It is not the relationship of equals. It is the relationship of a human to an animal. This brings us to a central metaphor that would poison Western political thought for 2,000 years, the great chain of being and the body politic. The Greeks, for all their dazzling brilliance, for all their invention of democracy and philosophy and theater, were also the great theoreticians of inequality. They took the unspoken assumptions of the Egyptian and Mesopotamian bureaucracies and turned them into a formal system of thought. Aristotle, the great mind who tutored Alexander the Great, looked at the world and sorted it. He was a man who loved classification. He classified animals into those with blood and those without. He classified governments into monarchies, aristocracies, and polities. And when he looked at the countryside of Attica, he classified the man with the plow. In his Politics, he wrote quite plainly that the slave is a living tool, organon empsychon. He wrote that the ox is a poor man's slave. But regarding the peasant, the Jorgos, he argued something even more fundamental. He argued that some men are born to rule and others are born to be ruled. Those who work the land with their hands lack the logos, the reason, to participate in the polis, the city-state. The life of the peasant, Aristotle argued, is a life fit only for a beast. The peasant cannot be a citizen because a citizen must have skol, leisure. Not leisure in the modern sense of lounging on a beach, but leisure in the sense of time free from the demands of mere survival. The citizen must have time to attend the assembly, to serve on juries, to discuss philosophy in the agora, to train for war. The peasant, bent over his plow from dawn to dusk, has no such time. His mind is as stunted as his body is crooked. He is the soil of the state. He is not a citizen. He is the condition that allows citizens to exist. He is the manure from which the flower of philosophy grows. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. Aristotle was not a sadist. He was a man attempting to describe the world as he found it, and to justify it as natural. And in his description, the peasant is not a victim of injustice. He is a creature fulfilling his natural function. Just as the ox is naturally suited to pull the plow, the peasant is naturally suited to hold it. To ask the peasant to participate in government would be as absurd as asking the ox to deliver a speech. This was the great ideological achievement of the classical world. It turned a political and economic arrangement into a fact of nature. The peasant was not oppressed. He was simply being what he was born to be. The Romans perfected this. They took the Greek theory and applied it with the relentless efficiency of their legions and their lawyers. They had a word for it: instrumentum vocale. The ancient agricultural writer Marcus Terentius Varro, in his treatise Res Rusticae on agriculture, written in the 1st century BC, divides the tools of the farm into 3 categories. He is writing a manual for the gentleman farmer, a guide to running a profitable estate. And in this manual he writes, "All agriculture is carried out by men, or by beasts, or by implements. Some divide these into 3 categories: the speaking tools, the inarticulate tools, and the mute tools. The speaking tools are the slaves. The inarticulate tools are the oxen. The mute tools are the wagons, the plows, and the baskets." Read that again. Let it settle into your understanding. Instrumentum vocale, the speaking tool. A human being defined by their function of emitting sound while performing the labor of an ox. This is not the language of hatred. It is the language of the spreadsheet. It is the cold, efficient logic of the latifundia, the vast, slave-staffed estates that drove the Roman Republic's economy and crushed the smallholder farmer. The Roman agronomist Columella, writing in the 1st century AD, produced a 12-volume work on agriculture that is breathtaking in its detail and chilling in its implications. He writes about the best soil for vines. He writes about the proper pruning of olive trees. And he writes about the management of the familia rustica, the household of rural slaves and tenant farmers. He advises the owner on how many modii of grain a plowman should be fed per day to maximize his output without collapsing from exhaustion. He recommends a diet of coarse bread, cheap wine, and a few olives, enough to keep the body moving, not enough to encourage any spark of vitality. He advises the owner to inspect the slaves' quarters regularly to ensure they are not hoarding food or weapons. He advises the owner to work the slaves in chain gangs if they are particularly unruly. He writes with the same clinical detachment that he uses when discussing the amount of hay needed to keep a mule's coat glossy, or the best method for castrating a bull calf. The Roman estate, the latifundium, was a machine for turning human labor into agricultural profit. And the peasants, both the outright slaves and the nominally free coloni who rented small plots, were the fuel. Cato the Elder, that paragon of old Roman virtue, wrote a manual on farming that includes the following advice: sell worn-out oxen, blemished cattle, blemished sheep, wool, hides, an old wagon, old iron tools, an old slave, a sickly slave, and whatever else is superfluous. The old slave is listed between the old wagon and the old iron tools. He is an asset that has depreciated. He is to be sold before he becomes a liability. There is no pension for the instrumentum vocale. There is only the scrap heap. But the peasant is a stubborn creature. The ox stays where you put him. The mule may kick, but he does not dream. The peasant, even the one chained by debt and law, even the one beaten and branded and fed on gruel, dreams of the horizon. He dreams of a plot of land that is his own. He dreams of a day without the overseer's stick. He dreams of a full belly and a warm fire and a life that is not measured out in modi of grain owed to the master. And so the state built a fence made of parchment. Enter the Roman Emperor Diocletian, near the end of the 3rd century AD. The empire is wobbling on its foundations. Inflation is running wild. The currency so debased that a sack of silver coins can barely buy a sack of wheat. Cities are emptying as the wealthy retreat to their fortified country villas. The army, filled with barbarian recruits, demands ever more pay. And, most terrifying to the Senate and the landowning class, the colony are running away. They are slipping off the estates, melting into the forests, joining the bands of outlaws and rebels known as the Bagodai, who roam the countryside of Gaul and Spain, attacking the villas and freeing the slaves. Diocletian was a reformer, a man of iron will who had risen from humble origins to seize the purple. He reorganized the empire, divided it into eastern and western halves, and attempted to freeze the entire social order in place. His solution to the problem of the fleeing peasants was as elegant as it was monstrous. He issued an edict, part of a broader package of reforms that declared, "The agricultural worker is to be bound to the soil." The Latin phrase is glebe adscriptus, ascribed to the clod. This is the birth certificate of the European serf. It was a law that said, "You are not a person who works this land. You are a feature of this land." If a new owner buys the estate, he buys the colony attached to it. The sale deed lists the number of olive trees, the condition of the winepress, the acreage of pasture, and the number of cassati, hut dwellers, with their wives and children. They are an extension of the soil's fertility. If the soil was left fallow, it was a problem to be corrected. If the peasant was left idle, it was the same problem. To move from one village to another was not immigration, it was theft of self. The state would dispatch soldiers to retrieve a runaway serf, just as they would chase down a prized stallion that had jumped the paddock fence. The serf was branded, sometimes literally on the forehead, to mark him as the property of a particular estate. He was Colonus, the tiller, and he would till until he died, and his sons would till after him, forever and ever, world without end. The Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor, reinforced these laws. The Emperor Theodosius, the last to rule a united empire, codified them into the Codex Theodosianus, and the barbarian kings who carved up the Western Empire, the Goths, the Franks, the Burgundians, found the system of the bound peasant perfectly suited to their needs. They simply stepped into the role of the Roman landlord. The glebe adscriptus became the servus cassatus, the housed serf of the early Middle Ages. The legal architecture of the ancient world, designed to treat humans as inventory, was passed intact to the new Germanic rulers. As the Roman sun set and the medieval fog rolled in, this concept ossified into the structure we know as manorialism. The manor was the basic unit of economic and social life in medieval Europe. It was a self-sufficient world, a little kingdom in miniature. At its center stood the Lord's house, perhaps a rough stone tower, perhaps a timbered hall. Around it clustered the fields, the meadows, the woods, and the village where the peasants lived in their one-room hovels of wattle and daub, sharing their space with the pigs and the chickens. The lord of the manor owned the oven, the mill, the winepress, and the justice. He did not own the serf's soul. That belonged to God, and the church was very clear on that point. But he owned the serf's time, his sweat, and the use of his body and the bodies of his family. The serf owed the Lord a certain number of days of labor each week on the Lord's own land, the domain. This was the week work. During harvest and planting, the Lord could demand boon work, extra days of labor at the times when the crop was most vulnerable. The serf had to drop his own sickle, leave his own wheat standing in the field, and go to harvest the Lord's grain first. If the Lord's grain rotted in the field because of the serf's neglect, it was a crime. If the serf's grain rotted because he was working the Lord's land, it was just the way of the world. And then there were the dues, the endless, grinding, humiliating dues that reminded the serf every day of his animal status. The chevage was a tax paid just for being alive, a head tax akin to the one levied on a sheep. The merchet was a fine paid by the serf for permission for his daughter to marry. This was not a sentimental fee. It was a stud fee in reverse. If the daughter married a man from another manor, she would leave, and the Lord would lose her future offspring, the next generation of laborers. So the Lord charged a fee to compensate for his loss. The heriot was a death tax. When a serf died, his best beast, his ox, his cow, his horse, was taken by the Lord. If he had no beast, his best possession, his cloak, his pot, his bed, was taken. The Lord was reclaiming a piece of his property. The serf had been allowed to use these things in life, but in death they reverted to the owner. The language of the barnyard remained the language of governance. In the great agricultural treatise of 13th century England, Walter of Henley's Husbandry, the author advises the Lord's bailiff on how to manage the plough team. The oxherd must be sharp and wise, he writes, and he must oversee that the ploughmen do their work well and truly, and not waste the seed or leave land unbroken, and let the oxherd sleep with his oxen in the byre, for they are the wealth of the manor. The bailiff was not a manager of human resources, he was a chief herdsman. His job was to ensure the bipedal livestock did not grow sick, did not steal the seed corn, did not breed discontent, and above all, did not stop moving. The medieval peasant's diet was porridge and pottage, a thin gruel of boiled grains, sometimes with a few vegetables thrown in, rarely with meat. Gruel is, quite literally, what you feed to pigs in a trough when you want to keep them alive, but not lively. It is the perfect fuel for a slow, heavy, but sustained output of labor. Meat was a luxury reserved for the Lord's table. The peasant might keep a pig, but he would likely have to give a portion of it to the Lord. He might keep chickens, but the eggs went to the manor house. He might fish in the Lord's stream, but if he was caught, he would lose a hand. The forests, the rivers, the very air he breathed, all belonged to the Lord. The peasant was a guest on his own land, a tenant in his own body. The church, which might have been a counterweight to this system, often reinforced it. The great monasteries of medieval Europe were among the largest landowners, and they were no gentler than the secular lords. The abbot of a great house like Cluny or St. Albans kept meticulous records of his serfs, his rents, his labor dues. The monks prayed for the souls of the dead, including the souls of the peasants, but they did not question the divine order that placed the peasant in the muck and the lord in the castle. The three orders of medieval society, oratores, bellatores, laboratores, those who pray, those who fight, those who work, were said to be ordained by God. The peasant was the feet of the social body, tramping through the mud, while the clergy were the head and the nobility were the arms. It was a body politic in which the feet were not expected to think. There is perhaps no more chilling example of this inventory mindset than the Domesday Book of 1086. William the Conqueror, having taken England by the sword, wanted to know what he owned. He sent his men across the realm, into every shire, every hundred, every village. They knocked on every wattle and daub door. They asked the same questions over and over. Who holds this land? How many ploughs are there? How many villagers? How many smallholders? How many slaves? How much woodland? How much meadow? How much pasture? How many mills? How many fisheries? What was the value in the time of King Edward? What is the value now? The Domesday Book doesn't read like a census of a nation. It reads like a stocktake of a very large, very muddy farm. A typical entry reads, "In Middleton, Earl Edwin holds 3 hides. There is land for 12 ploughs. In Domain there are 2 ploughs, and 8 villeins, and 4 borders with 2 ploughs. There is a mill rendering 40 pence. There are 30 acres of meadow. There are 100 sheep. The value is 60 shillings. The villeins and the borders, the different grades of peasants, are listed in the same breathless, bureaucratic cadence as the ploughs, the meadow, and the sheep. The value of a manor was calculated not by the happiness of its inhabitants, but by its yield, and yield meant the combined output of the grain, the wool, the milk, and the human labor. The Domesday Book freezes a moment in time. It shows us an England where roughly 10% of the population were outright slaves, servi, who could be bought and sold like cattle. Another 30 to 40% were villeins or borders or cotters, various grades of unfree peasants who owed labor and dues to a lord. The free peasant, the sokeman or the liber homo, was a minority, concentrated in the old Danelaw areas of eastern England where Viking settlement had disrupted the manorial system. For the vast majority of the people of England, the Domesday Book was a document that reduced their entire existence to a number on a page, a line item in the inventory of a Norman conqueror. The Black Death of the 14th century was the one moment in this long, gray history where the livestock almost broke the fence. The plague arrived in Europe in 1347, carried by rats and fleas on Genoese ships fleeing the siege of Kaffa in the Crimea. It spread with terrifying speed, killing between a third and half of the population in a few short years. Whole villages were depopulated. Fields lay fallow, not for any lord's order, but because there was no one left to plow them. The great grinding scarcity of medieval life was suddenly inverted. There was a surplus of land and a desperate shortage of people. And suddenly the speaking tools discovered their power. A serf named John, who had spent his whole life being worth less than a good plow horse, found that his labor was now rare. He could demand wages. He could demand better terms for his tenancy. He could run away to a city where, if he survived a year and a day, he became a freeman. He could look his lord in the eye and say, "No, I will not work your domain for nothing. Pay me what I am worth." The lords were horrified. The natural order of the world was being overturned. The oxen were demanding to sit at the table. The response from the ruling class was one of pure, panicked animal husbandry. The English Parliament, dominated by the great landowners, passed the Statute of Laborers in 1351. This law was not about economics in the modern sense. It was about taxonomy. It stated that every able-bodied man and woman under the age of 60, not having a trade or land of their own, shall be bound to serve the employer who shall require him to do so, and they must accept the wages that were paid before the plague. It was a legal attempt to rechain the herd that had escaped the barn. It was the whip of the state trying to reassert that a peasant who asks for more coin was like an ox who refuses the yoke, a creature out of its natural order, a monster that must be beaten back into submission. The statute was enforced with a new system of local justices of the peace, who were, of course, drawn from the very class of landowners who benefited from the low wages. Peasants who demanded higher pay were branded with hot irons on the forehead. They were thrown into the stocks. They were imprisoned. The message was clear. You are not negotiating. You are not a free agent in a market. You are a resource that has temporarily become scarce, and the state will correct that scarcity by force. And when the peasants pushed back in the Great Rising of 1381, the forces of order responded with the full violence of the state. The rebels, led by men like Wat Tyler and inspired by the radical priest John Ball, marched on London. They burned the palaces of the hated lawyers and tax collectors. They captured the Tower of London and beheaded the Archbishop of Canterbury. They presented their demands to the young King Richard II, the abolition of serfdom, a fixed rent for land, the right to hunt and fish freely. They chanted the famous rhyme that John Ball had preached from the village greens. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? It was the first time in 1,000 years that the beasts of burden asked the question, why are we the only ones pulling the plow? And for a brief, terrifying moment for the ruling class, it seemed as if the answer might change. The king met with the rebels, and with the guile of a 14-year-old who had been raised in the snake pit of medieval politics, agreed to all their demands. He signed charters of manumission. The rebels, believing they had won, began to disperse, and then the king's men rode out. Wat Tyler was stabbed to death by the Lord Mayor of London during a parley, a murder committed in plain sight of the king. The leaderless rebels were hunted down. The charters were revoked. King Richard, according to the chroniclers, told the captured rebels, "Villains you are, and villains you shall remain." The experiment in peasant liberation was over. The herd had been rounded up, the fence repaired, the hierarchy restored. But the Black Death had planted a seed that could not be entirely uprooted. Over the next century and a half, serfdom slowly withered away in England and much of Western Europe. It was replaced not by freedom in the modern sense, but by a different kind of unfreedom, the unfreedom of the market. The peasant was no longer legally bound to the soil, but he was bound by economic necessity. He still needed land. He still needed work. And the lords, now transitioning from feudal magnates to capitalist landlords, were finding new ways to extract value from the land and the people who worked it. This administrative view of the peasant body did not end with the Middle Ages. It simply changed uniforms. It put on the wig of the enclosure movement lawyer. In 16th and 17th century England, and later across the continent, lords and wealthy yeomen looked at the common land, the pasture where the peasant's single cow grazed, the woods where his pig foraged, the stream where he fished, and saw waste. They saw an inefficient use of the landscape. They saw a landscape that could be improved. The common lands were the life support system of the English peasantry. Without the common, a peasant family could not survive. The cow gave milk, the pig gave meat, the geese gave feathers, the woods gave fuel and building materials, the stream gave fish. The common was not a luxury, it was the difference between a bare subsistence and starvation, and it was held not by individual ownership, but by customary right, by the ancient, unwritten laws of the village. The enclosure movement swept all of that away. Parliamentary acts, pieces of paper signed by the king and stamped with the Great Seal, declared, "This land, which was previously held in common by the village herd, is now private property." Commissioners rode out from London to the villages. They surveyed the land. They drew up new maps with straight lines and neat rectangles. They divided the common among the landowners according to their existing holdings. The lord got the lion's share. The wealthier yeoman got smaller parcels. The poor cottager, who had no legal claim to the land, got nothing. Sir Thomas More, in his book Utopia, famously remarked that in England, sheep are eating men. He meant it literally. The landowners were kicking the peasants off the soil to turn the fields into vast, profitable sheep runs for the wool trade. The English wool trade was the engine of the Tudor economy, and sheep required far fewer workers than plough agriculture. A single shepherd and his dog could manage a flock that had previously supported a dozen peasant families. The human being, who for centuries had been the slow, reliable plough ox of the nation, was being displaced by the actual, four-legged, wool-producing sheep, because the profit margin on the latter was higher. The peasant was not just livestock, he was obsolete livestock. The tragedy of the enclosures was not just the loss of land. It was the final, brutal realization that in the grand ledger of power, the value of a human body was purely a function of its yield per acre. If a sheep yielded more than a family, the family was culled from the land like so much scrub brush. The enclosed peasant became a landless laborer, forced to hire himself out for wages that barely kept body and soul together. He moved to the city, where the factories of the coming industrial revolution were waiting to swallow him whole. Or he became a vagrant, a sturdy beggar, hunted by the authorities and punished by branding, whipping, or even execution under the savage Elizabethan poor laws. The same story played out across the continent. In France, the peasants remained on the land longer, but they were crushed by an ever-increasing burden of taxation. The French peasant of the 17th and 18th centuries owed dues to the king, the church, and the local seigneur. He paid the tille, the land tax. He paid the gabelle, the salt tax, which forced him to buy a set amount of overpriced salt from the royal monopoly. He paid the corvée, the old forced labor, now used to build the royal roads. He paid the dîme, the tithe, to the church. And he paid the champart, the cens, and a dozen other feudal dues to his local lord. By the time the peasant had paid all his obligations, he was left with barely enough to feed his family. He was a squelette, a skeleton, in the words of the observers of the time. When the French Revolution came in 1789, the peasants rose up not with the sophisticated political theories of the Parisian lawyers and journalists, but with a primal, millennial fury. They burned the manor houses. They destroyed the terriers, the great leather-bound books that recorded the feudal dues. They wanted to erase the written record of their own subjugation. They wanted to be free of the documents that had counted them like sheep for 1,000 years. And in the famous decrees of the night of August 4th, 1789, the National Assembly abolished feudalism. The gleba adscriptus was finally, legally, dead in France. But the logic of the inventory did not die. It crossed the Atlantic and found new soil in the plantations of the New World. The African slave trade was the ultimate expression of the human as livestock paradigm. The enslaved African was captured, branded, chained, and packed into the holds of ships like so many barrels of cargo. He was listed on the ship's manifest not by name, but by number. He was sold on the auction block, his teeth examined, his muscles prodded, his value assessed by the same cold calculus that a farmer uses when buying a mule. The slave codes of the American South defined the enslaved person as chattel, personal property, movable goods. The slave could be bought, sold, mortgaged, rented out, given as a gift, or bequeathed in a will. The slave's children inherited the status of the mother. They were born inventory. And in the cotton fields of Alabama and Mississippi, the same techniques of labor management that Varro and Columella had described were applied with a new industrial intensity. The overseer's whip replaced the Roman vitis, the vine stock that was the symbol of the centurion's authority. The slave's diet of fatback and cornmeal was the New World version of the Roman slave's ration of coarse bread and cheap wine. The slave's cabin was the equivalent of the Roman ergastulum, the barracks for the chain gang. The plantation ledger recorded the births, deaths, purchases, and sales of enslaved people with the same detached precision that a cattle rancher uses to track his herd. The American South was not a feudal society. It was a capitalist society, fully integrated into the global market. But its labor system was built on the ancient pre-feudal assumption that some human beings are instrumentum vocale, speaking tools. And the ideology of white supremacy was the American version of Aristotle's theory of natural slavery. The enslaved African, the argument went, was naturally suited to labor under the hot sun. He lacked the logos to participate in Republican government. He was a child, a beast, a thing. He was livestock with a human face. The Industrial Revolution, which was supposed to liberate humanity from the tyranny of the soil, simply transferred the logic of the herd to the factory floor. The factory owner did not see a man named Robert with a bad back and a daughter at home. He saw a hand. You didn't hire a person, you hired hands, the term is revealing. It reduces the human being to the body part that performs the work. The rest of the person, his mind, his heart, his soul, is irrelevant to the transaction. The mill owners of Manchester and Lowell, Massachusetts, recruited mill girls from the impoverished farms of New England. They housed them in company dormitories, regulated their waking and sleeping hours, and required them to attend church on Sundays. The mill girls were checked for the soundness of their lungs and the nimbleness of their fingers, just as a farmer checks a young calf for signs of health. They were paid wages that were just enough to keep them alive and working, but not enough to allow them any independence. When they grew sick or old or simply worn out, they were dismissed and replaced with fresh hands from the countryside. The children of the Industrial Revolution fared even worse. The factory owners of England preferred child laborers because their small hands could reach into the machinery to fix broken threads, and because they could be paid even less than adults. The children worked 12, 14, 16 hours a day in the hot, lint-filled air of the cotton mills. Their bodies were stunted. Their lungs were choked with fibers. Their lives were measured out in the relentless ticking of the factory clock. They were the instrumentum vocale of the machine age, the speaking tools who tended the mute tools of the steam engine and the power loom. The time clock replaced the sundial. The factory whistle replaced the church bell. But the principle remained unchanged. The body was fuel. The worker was a cost of production, to be minimized as much as possible. The factory owner who provided decent wages and safe working conditions was not seen as a moral paragon. He was seen as a fool who was wasting his profits. The logic of the market, like the logic of the manor, demanded that the laboring body be stripped to its bare minimum, fed just enough to keep it moving, and discarded when it was spent. And what of the modern world? Have we escaped this ancient logic? Look around you. The language of the inventory is still with us. We speak of human resources, a term that reduces the complex, irreducible reality of a human life to a pool of extractable value. We speak of labor markets, as if human effort were a commodity to be bought and sold like bushels of wheat. We speak of productivity and efficiency and optimization, the same words that Columella used when calculating the ration of a plowman. The modern corporation, that great engine of wealth, is organized around the same principles that organize the latifundium and the manor. It has a hierarchy. It has managers and managed. It has performance reviews and metrics. It has a relentless focus on the bottom line. The worker is still a cost to be controlled, a resource to be deployed, a number on a spreadsheet. The fact that the worker can quit and find another job, the fact that she has legal rights and a vote and a voice, does not change the fundamental structure of the relationship. She is still selling her body's time and capacity for labor to someone who owns the means of production. She is still, in a very real sense, instrumentum vocale. The gig economy has taken this logic to its extreme. The Uber driver, the DoorDash delivery person, the Amazon warehouse worker, they are not employees. They are independent contractors. They have no benefits, no job security, no protection from arbitrary termination. They are paid by the task, by the delivery, by the mile. Their time is sliced into ever smaller units of exchange. They are the ultimate flexible labor force, available at the touch of a button, deployed by an algorithm that tracks their every movement and discarded the moment demand slackens. They are the colony of the 21st century, bound not to the soil but to the app, tied not by law but by the desperate necessity of survival in a world where the safety net has been shredded. Whenever we hear a debate about a population being referred to as a labor pool or a workforce asset, whenever we see a migrant worker's humanity reduced to a line on a balance sheet of economic contributions versus resource drain, whenever we hear the value of a person's life discussed in terms of their productivity, we are hearing the echo of Varro's instrumentum vocale. We are smelling the dust of the Domesday Book. We are feeling the weight of the corvée. The great and terrible story of civilization is the story of how we learn to treat the land. But the land has always been, and always will be, people. And for the vast majority of the last 10,000 years, the men and women who held the plow, who waded through the mud of the Nile and the muck of the Thames, who bent their backs under the Mesopotamian sun and the Lancashire rain, were seen not as the foundation of the world, but as its most easily replaceable farm equipment. They were the ones who fed the architects, the generals, and the kings. They were the ones who built the pyramids, dug the canals, and harvested the grain. They were the ones who, in the records of the mighty, were counted and valued no higher than the patient, dumb ox that walked beside them. And yet they endured. They sang songs whose words are lost to us. They told stories around the fire. They fell in love, raised children, buried their dead. They found moments of joy and meaning in lives that were, from the perspective of the scribe and the Lord, nothing but a line item in a ledger. They were not livestock. They were never livestock. They were human beings, full of the same hopes and fears and dreams as the pharaohs and the emperors and the captains of industry. And the history of treating them like animals is not a history of their nature, but a history of the failure of imagination and the corruption of power. It is a history that we must remember, not to wallow in guilt or to score political points, but to recognize the ancient patterns when they reappear in new guises. Because the ledger is still being written, the inventory is still being taken, and the question of who is counted as a person and who is counted as a thing is the question that defines every age. We've reached the end. Thank you for listening all the way through. This was The History of Treating Peasants Like Livestock, brought to you by Steve Buttercup III. If this was worth your time, a like and a subscribe go a long way. And if you have thoughts on the story or if something stood out, let me know in the comments. I've begun growing a library of more audiobooks like this to be released on Spotify over the next few months. You can listen there for free if you're a Spotify Premium member. Otherwise, the paid support is appreciated but not needed. If you're interested in dark history, power, unsettling questions, doomed figures, and uncomfortable historical parallels, find my X or Twitter page. Thank you for listening.